With us now, Tom Dupree, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General under George W. Bush, constitutional law attorney extraordinaire, argued lots of cases before the Supreme Court. This is an important point that Gavin Newsom brought up. The state of California has sued President Trump for deploying the California National Guard without his approval, and essentially wants a federal judge to order the National Guardsmen back to their barracks. Does a judge have that power?
I don't see a judge ordering Trump on how he can use the military in this situation. And you'll note that the judge, Charles Breyer, who is actually the brother of former Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, he's generally speaking a liberal judge from California. He rebuffed the governor's effort this afternoon to get a temporary restraining order issued on the governor's preferred schedule. The governor wanted something to issue immediately. The judge basically said, cool your jets, come back tomorrow. We'll decide this request in due course. So the early returns on the governor's lawsuit were not great.
Okay, want to play for you some sound from relatively liberal outlets and also from Democrats about Donald Trump's deployment of the California National Guard.
There's only one other branch outside the executive that may or may not be left, and that's the branch he's threatening with impeachment. And he's threatening as it relates to court actions that he may or may not follow, depending on the rule of Don. And that's the courts. And that's what we've got left. And so we have to stand up. We have to call out what this is really about. We have crossed the red line.
Okay. Others, Ted Lieu, Congressman, National Guard troops are following unlawful orders. The Attorney General of California, the Trump administration is involved in an unlawful power grab that is dangerous and reckless. What is the law here, Tom? If we see, for example, violence in Chicago, which indications are quite strong could happen this evening, or in New York, does the president have the right to order the state National Guard out?
Yes, he does. Look, federal law gives the president the power to deploy the Guard and federalize the Guard in certain situations, including if there's an insurrection, if there's an invasion, or to enforce federal law if the local law enforcement authorities can't do it. Now, look, the president does have broader authority under the Insurrection Act, which he has not yet invoked. If the president were to invoke that, that would allow the troops to engage in far broader activities than what they can do now. So the thing Trump did initially was to federalize the Guard, call out the Marines to perform more limited duties. But if circumstances change, at least he suggested, he might go to a more stronger power he has, which would be to invoke the Insurrection Act.
And the reason why may not be a legal question, because he can invoke the Insurrection Act at will. Can that be challenged by the courts, basically saying there's not an insurrection?
It could be challenged, but look, I think it's fair to say that the courts, and certainly the United States Supreme Court, I think are going to recognize fairly broad presidential authority in this context. The president, of course, is the commander-in-chief under our Constitution, and courts, particularly this Supreme Court, have been generally respectful of the president's power to exercise his commander-in-chief authority. That's not to say that there are no limits, but it would surprise me if the courts, in a case where Trump invoked the Insurrection Act or called out the military, it would surprise me if the courts gave a very narrow interpretation of the president's constitutional power in that respect.
In terms of what we're dealing with now, maybe more of an optics issue, and I think you're right to point out that the duties of the Guard are restricted and the duties of the Marines that have been called are even more restricted. And I think fair to say that Trump liked being able to say, I've called up the Marines, and on and on. It gives them sort of this feeling of he's the one to restore order, where Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass are not. Is there actual guidelines of what has to be happening for the Insurrection Act to be invoked? They didn't invoke it in 2020. Is there a difference for 2025?
Right. There aren't concrete guidelines. And look, the Insurrection Act has been very rarely invoked in American history, back in the early 90s in the LA riots under the first President Bush and the like. But it is not something that presidents routinely invoke. And it's not a law that the federal courts are used to applying or interpreting. So I think if the president were ultimately to invoke the Insurrection Act, I think to a large extent courts would be writing on a blank slate and basically analyzing what role, if any, they have to play in determining determining whether or not there is in fact an insurrection, or if that determination is something that the Constitution allows the president to decide.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.